Tonight we pull back the quilt of a familiar English landscape. You're standing at the edge of a broad, flat field in Suffolk, the kind of place you might drive past without a second thought. The sky is a low, gray blanket, and a raw wind snatches at your coat, carrying the distant smell of turned earth and diesel from a tractor working a distant rise. At your feet, the ground isn't soil but a complex mosaic of color and texture. Rectangles of ochre, dark chocolate, and pale yellow clay, marked out with strings and small, fluttering orange flags. This is an archaeological site, a temporary window into the earth. The air thrums with a low generator, and the steady, methodical scrape of a mason's trowel against compacted soil is the dominant sound. You're here because of a wind farm. A new access road needs to be built, and before the diggers can move in, a team has a few precious weeks to ask the land what it remembers. The lead archaeologist, her hands caked in mud, looks up at you and smiles a tight, focused smile. "We didn't expect much," she admits, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Geophysical survey showed some vague anomalies. But this is something else." She gestures to the ground before her. And there you see it. A pattern of dark, almost black stains against the lighter subsoil, arranged in two parallel lines. They are post holes, the ghosts of mighty timber uprights that vanished over a millennium ago. They mark the outline of a house. Not just any house, but an Anglo-Saxon longhouse, the communal heart of a forgotten settlement. You're not on the fringes of history here. You are standing in its front room. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch down, getting eye level with the past. The stains are so simple, so unadorned. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd walk right over them. But the archaeologist reads them like a thrilling novel. "See the depth here?" She points, her trowel tracing the edge of a circular stain about the width of a dinner plate. "That's where a great oak post stood. They'd have dug a hole, set the post, then packed the gap with stones to wedge it upright. Over centuries, the wood rots, the packing stones settle, and the fill becomes richer, darker organic matter. It's a signature." She moves along the line. "And here the spacing is regular. This was a wall. A long one." You follow her gaze along the two parallel lines of dark ghosts, stretching perhaps 15 meters into the next trench. Your mind's eye begins to strip away the thin topsoil, the modern plow-scarred earth, and rebuild. The dark stains become timber posts, rising from the ground, supporting a high, thatched roof that would have been smoky, warm, and loud with life. This isn't an object you can hold in a museum case. It's a negative space, an imprint. The house itself is gone, consumed by time and worms, but its shadow remains pressed into the earth. The wind feels colder now, knowing what this place was. This isn't a palace or a fortress. It's a home. It's where people were born, ate, argued, slept, and died. The sheer, mundane normality of it is what gives the moment its profound weight. Historians still argue whether these early Saxon structures were built by new arrivals from the continent or by the existing British population adopting new fashions and technologies. A quiet cultural shift rather than a dramatic invasion. But whoever they were, they chose this spot. They cleared the land, selected the trees, and labored to raise this framework. They did it here, on this unremarkable patch of Suffolk, for reasons we can only guess at. Shelter from the wind, proximity to water, good drainage, or simply because their parents had done the same nearby. A young digger nearby calls out, his voice cutting through your thoughts. He's found something. Not gold or weaponry, but a small, irregular lump of fired clay, blackened on one side. He brushes it gently. It's a piece of daub, mud and straw pressed between the wooden posts to form the walls. It's the very fabric of the vanished house, now crumbled and brittle in his palm. On one flat surface, you can see the perfect curved impression of a wicker hurdle, the weave of branches that formed the wall's inner skeleton. It's a fossil of everyday craft. You hold it and for a second the generator's drone fades. You're not feeling just cold clay. You're feeling the texture of a wall that someone smoothed with their hands, a task done on a day much like this one over 1,000 winters ago. They probably complained about the chill too. They likely stood back, wiped their brow, and judged their work before heading inside to warmth. And then you place the fragment carefully back on the ground, a piece of a puzzle that will never be fully complete. The excavation will continue, the post holes will be recorded with laser precision, photographed, and then inevitably the area will be surrendered. The wind turbine access road will be built, and the earth will be compacted over these ghostly stains once more. But for now, in this gray afternoon light, the house breathes again. Its story, long silent, has been asked for, and the land, in its own quiet way, has begun to answer. The archaeologist stands, pressing a hand into the small of her back to ease the stiffness. Her eyes aren't on the trench anymore. They're fixed on the far side of the field, following a line only she can see. "Come with me," she says, her tone shifting from the focused analysis of the trench to something more speculative, almost detective-like. You clamber out of the excavation, your boots heavy with clay, and follow her as she strides with purpose across the tufted grass of the untouched headland. You walk for a few minutes, away from the hum of the generator, until you reach a stile made of weathered oak. A worn wooden finger post points along a narrow path that snakes between two hedgerows. It's a public footpath, indicated on modern ordnance survey maps by a neat, dashed green line. She rests her arms on the top of the stile, looking back towards the excavation. "Now look," she instructs. You turn. From this vantage point, the geometry of the land snaps into a chilling clarity. The two parallel lines of post holes you've just left behind, the axis of the longhouse, are not randomly oriented. They are aligned precisely, almost unnervingly so, with the footpath you're now standing beside. The ancient wall and the modern right-of-way share the same intention, the same trajectory across the landscape. It feels less like a coincidence and more like a whisper passed directly from the past to the present. The longhouse was built with its long side facing this direction. Its main door might have opened onto this line of travel. This wasn't the back of the property. It was the front, facing what was, even then, a route. A path. Your mind, which had been firmly anchored in that one muddy trench, now begins to drift, pulled along that green dashed line on the map. This footpath doesn't exist in isolation. It meanders, yes, but with an underlying purpose, connecting a 21st century village to a parish church, that church to a nearby hamlet, and that hamlet to a shallow ford across a stream. It's a segment in a network. And the alignment suggests that the network is far older than the tarmac roads that now dominate. The Saxon house didn't just sit near a path, it was fundamentally oriented towards it, its architecture acknowledging the coming and going of people, animals, and goods. You step over the stile and onto the path itself. The ground is different here, softer, slightly sunken, a shallow groove worn into the earth by generations of feet. This is the phenomenon of holloway, where a root, used consistently over centuries, slowly wears down below the level of the surrounding land. In places, the roots of ancient hedgerow oaks are exposed, twisted like old ropes, undercut by the perpetual passage. You place your foot where countless others have, and the connection is visceral. A farmer from the 1950s in his Wellington boots walked here. A Victorian land surveyor with his theodolite paced this line. A medieval peasant, perhaps carrying a basket of eggs to a manor, trod this same sunken track. And before them all, someone from that longhouse, a woman going to fetch water from the stream, a man driving a small herd of sheep, walked this same corridor through the trees. The path is a palimpsest of journeys. The fact that it is now a legally protected public right-of-way is just its most recent chapter. Its original charter was written not on parchment, but by repeated footfall. Historians still argue whether major Anglo-Saxon routes were purely pragmatic, connecting resource points, or if they held deeper ritual or territorial significance, marking boundaries of tribal regions known as regions. But at this local scale, the purpose feels beautifully simple. This path connected home to water, home to pasture, home to the home of a relative or a rival in the next clearing. It was the capillary system of early medieval life, essential and unglamorous. And while empires rose and fell, while kingdoms were fought over and languages evolved, this simple need, to get from one place to another efficiently, persisted. The path adapted. It might have been widened when ox carts became common. Its route might have shifted a few yards when a new field boundary was planted. But its core purpose, its essential line across the landscape, proved more durable than the houses that bordered it. The longhouse rotted away. The village it belonged to may have vanished, its name forgotten. But the desire line it created, the most practical route from A to B, refused to die. It became a parish boundary, then a farm track, and finally, with the rise of recreational walking in the 20th century, a designated footpath. Its survival is a testament not to grand planning, but to sheer, stubborn utility. As you walk a few paces along its sunken course, the hawthorn branches leaning in overhead, you realize you are not following a path. You are following a habit, one over 1,000 years old, and still not broken. Back at the trench, the light is beginning to fade, casting long, cool shadows that make the patterns in the earth seem even more pronounced. The team is packing up tools, but the lead archaeologist is on her knees again, a large planning frame, a 1-meter square grid made of string and aluminium, laid over the eastern end of the structure. She's not digging now, but drawing, translating the stains into a precise ink record on waterproof permatrace paper. This is the crucial act of translation, from oath to archive. People think we just dig things up, she says without looking up, her hand steady as she plots the curve of a post hole. But mostly, we dig things out and then record the holes they left behind. The architecture is all in the voids. She taps her pencil point on a cluster of 3 dark stains just inside one of the long walls. See this? This isn't structural. This is a hearth. A domestic fireplace. The soil is reddened and full of charcoal flecks. Suddenly, the ghostly outline gains a heart, a source of heat and light and cooking. You can almost smell the wood smoke, thick and resinous, clinging to the thatch. This is the meticulous science of reading the plowed-over past. The longhouse you're reconstructing in your mind wasn't a flimsy hut. Its post holes are deep and substantial, suggesting a building that could withstand Atlantic gales. The 2 parallel lines you first saw are the long walls, but now you're shown smaller, internal stains that hint at partitions, perhaps separating a byre for animals at one end from the human living space. A design known as a byre dwelling that kept the livestock close for warmth and security. The width between the wall lines is consistent, giving the building a stable, rectangular footprint. From these simple measurements, an astonishing fact emerges. This was a large building. One of the most widely accepted facts of early Anglo-Saxon settlement is that these longhouses were communal, multi-generational homes. They were not cottages. They could be up to 19 meters long, longer than a modern semi-detached house, and shelter an extended family, their most valuable possessions, and their livestock under one enormous, thatched roof. It was the ultimate all-in-one solution: home, barn, workshop, and fortress. The archaeologist points to a slight but noticeable bulge in one of the wall lines. And here, we think this might be the entrance. A door in the long side, facing that path. She smiles. They weren't being antisocial. The main living area would have been around the central hearth. The floors were probably just compacted earth, spread with fresh rushes or straw that would be changed out when the smell became assertive. The space comes alive not with grand furniture, but with activity. In one corner, a vertical loom would have stood, the weight of woven wool pulling threads taut. Near the hearth, quern stones for grinding grain would have created a constant, gritty sound. The air would have been a complex soup. Wood smoke, the earthy scent of drying herbs hung from the roof beams, the sweet-sour smell of fermenting ale, the pungency of animals and worked leather. It was a world of wood, earth, straw, and flame. A lesser-known, slightly amusing detail survives in place name evidence and later medieval records. The area just inside the door, where the mud and muck from outside would be traipsed in, had a specific name. It was sometimes called the mew or the mire. It was the original mudroom, a designated dirty space where you'd scrape your boots, or in their case, your leather-bound feet, before entering the cleaner, central living space. Even 1,000 years ago, someone was telling someone else not to bring the outside in. As she finishes her section drawing, she highlights a curious feature. At the gable end of the house, opposite where the animals might have been kept, the post holes are shallower, less distinct. This end might have been rebuilt, she muses. The posts were replaced, maybe after a storm or just general decay. They didn't dig as deep the second time. Or perhaps this was a later modification, an extension. This is where the simple story of a house was built and then it fell down gets complicated. The building had a biography. It was repaired, altered, adapted to changing needs or a growing family. Each dark stain in the earth is a sentence in that biography, and the archaeologists are its slow, careful readers. They won't find a name for the family who lived here. But by measuring the depth of a post hole, analyzing the soil chemistry around the hearth, and mapping the relationship of this building to others yet to be excavated, they are writing the first chapter of a story that has been buried since the very concept of England was just a fuzzy idea in the minds of a few regional kings. The house is gone, but its footprint, its stubborn refusal to be completely erased, is a message in a bottle, and the bottle is made of Suffolk clay. Let's step over the threshold of that dark stain in the earth and into the wood smoke haze. The door, a heavy plank possibly reinforced with iron bands, swings inward on leather hinges with a soft groan. Immediately the world changes. The sharp, clean wind of the Suffolk field is gone, replaced by a dense, enveloping warmth that carries 100 stories on its breath. This is not an empty shell. It is a crowded, vibrant, noisy universe under one long roof. Your eyes sting slightly, adjusting to the dimness, the only light coming from the open door behind you and the flickering orange heart of the central hearth a few paces ahead. The roof is lost in a gloom thick with smoke, which curls lazily upwards before finding its way out through gaps in the thatch. A primitive but effective ventilation system that also cured the timber beams, turning them black and resinous over decades. This is the daily grind in a wooden world, and it is anything but quiet. Sound comes first. There's the constant friendly crackle and spit of burning oak logs on the hearth. Underneath that, a rhythmic grating crunch. Scrunch scraw scrunch scraw, as a woman seated on a low stool works a saddle quern. She pushes a heavy handstone back and forth over a larger base stone, grinding barley kernels into a coarse, dark flour. It's monotonous, muscle-aching work, a sound as fundamental to this home as a heartbeat. From the far end, beyond a wattle partition, comes the shift and snuffle of cattle, the stamp of a hoof on an earth floor, the warm, sweet smell of their breath and dung mingling with the smoke. A dog, lean and shaggy, lifts its head from near the fire, thumps its tail once on the packed earth and goes back to sleep. Someone is talking a low, steady conversation about the boggy ground near the stream and whether the new calf will thrive. The language is Old English, all guttural rhythms and hard consonants, utterly foreign to your ear, but the tone, a mix of concern, practicality, and tired familiarity, is as clear as day. This space is a monument to multifunctionality. There are no rooms, only zones defined by use and the fragile barriers of wicker screens or hanging textiles. Near the fire is the prime real estate. Here an older man is carefully rubbing rendered animal fat into a strip of leather, making it supple for a harness. A child, perhaps 5 or 6, is assembling a small pile of smooth pebbles, a simple game in the dust. The floor around the hearth is the cleanest, swept relatively free of debris, a place to sit, work, and gather. As you move away from the light and heat, the zones shift. Along the walls are the sleeping areas, simple raised platforms of timber and straw, piled with woolen blankets and furs. Personal possessions, a finely carved bone comb, a necklace of amber beads, an iron knife in a sheath, might be tucked into the wattle walls or stored in a small wooden chest. Historians still argue whether these longhouses were primarily human dwellings with an animal annex, or whether the integration was so complete that the social unit was the hearth group, which included both people and their livestock in a single symbiotic community. The division was likely porous, especially on a freezing winter night when the body heat from the cattle was a precious commodity. The sensory experience is overwhelming, and not all of it is pleasant by modern standards. There is the ever-present pungent aroma of the byre. There is the sour tang of the ale vat, a large pottery vessel brewing in a corner. There is the earthy smell of unwashed wool and human sweat, cut through with the sharper scent of the herbs, mint, thyme, perhaps wormwood, hanging in bundles from the roof beams to dry. This was not a life of pristine cleanliness, but of managed odor. And yet there are moments of startling beauty. The firelight catches the intricate, interlocking carvings on a wooden loom weight, turning it into a dancing golden artifact. The texture of a hand-woven blanket, thick and nubbly, is surprisingly soft. The lesser-known detail that brings a smile is the presence of pets, or at least companion animals beyond working dogs. Archaeological finds in settlement sites include the carefully buried skeletons of small dogs and even cats, creatures too small to be of much practical use, but whose bones show no signs of butchery. They were likely tolerated, even cherished, for the simple comfort of their presence. A tiny warm body to stroke by the fire, a silent confidant in a loud, demanding world. It's a humble, universal touch that bridges the centuries in an instant. In this smoky, noisy, crowded hall, the struggle wasn't for glory or conquest, but for warmth, for full bellies, for the health of children and cattle, and for the preservation of stories in the long, dark winters. The epic poem of Beowulf might have been recited in halls like this, but the real epic was the daily grind of keeping the fire lit and the roof overhead. The discovery of the longhouse is the headline, the dramatic opening chapter. But archaeology, in its patient way, rarely lets a simple story stand. As the team expanded their trenches, fanning out from the post holes like detectives searching a crime scene, their trowels began to tell a deeper, older, and more complex tale. The Saxon settlers, it turns out, were not pioneers in a virgin wilderness. They were newcomers to a landscape that was already profoundly old, a palimpsest where every new generation wrote its story over the faint, but never quite erased, handwriting of the past. The first clue was a scatter of worked flint, black and sharp, littering the subsoil like discarded punctuation. Then, a few meters from the longhouse's hearth, in a layer of soil sealed beneath the Saxon occupation level, a digger's careful scraping revealed a slender, leaf-shaped beauty, a perfectly crafted flint arrowhead. You hold it now, cradled in the palm of a nitrile-gloved hand. It is smaller than you imagined, about the length of your thumb from knuckle to tip, but its craftsmanship is breathtaking. It has been knapped with extraordinary skill, its edges pressure-flaked into a series of tiny, serrated teeth, its form symmetrical and lethally elegant. This isn't Saxon. It isn't even Iron Age or Bronze Age. The archaeologist, her voice hushed with a different kind of awe, dates it to the Neolithic. The New Stone Age. We're looking at something lost by a hunter over 6,000 years ago, she says. Maybe more. The number hangs in the air, vast and incomprehensible. 6,000 years. When this arrowhead was hafted to a shaft, the great megaliths of Stonehenge were still unquarried. The pyramids of Giza were unthinkable. Britain was a land of dense, wildwood and wandering, nomadic communities. The person who made this was a master of their technology, hunting deer or perhaps defending their group in a world we can scarcely imagine. And they stood, or knelt, or fell, on this exact spot. This one exquisite object shatters the timeline. The Saxon longhouse, for all its historical distance, suddenly feels almost modern, a recent structure built atop a depth of time that makes the 1,400-year gap to the present seem trivial. The field is no longer just a Saxon site. It is a time capsule with multiple, distinct layers. The archaeology reveals a widely accepted fact about the British landscape. It is almost never truly empty of human history. Sites are often multi-period, with one community choosing a location for reasons: a south-facing slope, good drainage, proximity to water, a defensive view, that remained compelling for millennia. The Saxon settlers, clearing a patch of woodland or reclaiming abandoned pasture, were unconsciously following a precedent set thousands of winters before. Their plows would have turned up worked flints, puzzling stones that they might have viewed as elf-shot or tokens from a forgotten people. Their folklore likely contained echoes of these much older inhabitants, their barrows and earthworks explained as the works of giants or ancient gods. But the arrowhead is just the most eloquent speaker. The soil tells other, subtler stories. There are patches of charcoal-rich soil with no relation to the Saxon hearth, the remains of much older campfires. There are discolorations that might be the ghost of a prehistoric pit, dug for storage or rubbish. The very geology underfoot changes subtly. The team has hit a layer of gravel, a remnant of an ancient river course that once ran through this valley, a river that the Neolithic hunter would have known and the Saxon farmer would have drawn water from. Historians still argue whether there was any direct cultural or genetic continuity between these deep prehistoric populations and the Anglo-Saxons, or whether Britain's history is one of successive, near-total replacements. The evidence in the ground suggests at the very least a continuity of place. The land remembered what people forgot. The footpath the Saxons used and formalized might have begun as a deer trail, then a hunter's track, then a route between seasonal camps. Each era laid down a thin, almost invisible layer of presence: a flint tool, a post hole, a hearth, like sedimentary rock forming from cosmic dust. You look from the delicate arrowhead in your hand to the rough outline of the longhouse in the earth, and the message is humbling. We are all just temporary residents, adding our own faint stains to a document that was already ancient before our chapter began. The Saxon village wasn't founded. It was the latest sentence in a story that had been quietly unfolding for over 6,000 years. To understand why those Saxon families chose this slope, this particular view of the path and the stream, we must rewind the clock past the Neolithic hunter and into a more recent but profoundly chaotic twilight. Imagine the year is 410 AD. A letter, of sorts, has arrived in the province of Britannia from the Emperor Honorius in Ravenna. Its message, as recorded by the historian Zosimus, is brutally simple. The cities of Britain should look to their own defense. The Roman legions, the ultimate guarantors of order, tax collection and military power for nearly 4 centuries, are not coming back. They are needed to fight fires closer to the heart of an empire that is crumbling in on itself. The effect is not like turning off a light switch, but like cutting the engine on a great complex machine. It doesn't stop instantly. It coasts, shudders, and then grinds to a halt piece by piece. You are not in a Suffolk field now, but somewhere in the corroding skeleton of a Roman vicus, a small town that grew up around a fort or a posting station. The neat, rectangular military planning is still visible in the streets, but they are becoming choked with weeds. The public bathhouse is cold, its hypocaust system silent. The roof of the basilica has a dangerous sag. The people here are not Romans from Italy. They are the local Brittonic population who had adapted to Roman ways, speaking a form of vulgar Latin, using coinage, and enjoying imported olive oil and wine. Now the coins become scarcer, then stop arriving altogether. The long-distance trade networks fray and snap. The central authority that maintained the roads, the water pipes, the courts, and the army simply evaporates. What's left is a landscape of magnificent ruins and a power vacuum so vast it practically hums. Into this silence, new sounds begin to travel. From across the North Sea, from what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, come the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians. The traditional image is of a violent, coordinated invasion. A wave of warriors in boats, swords gleaming, described by later British chronicler Gildas as a fire of righteous vengeance. But the archaeology of places like our Suffolk field suggests a slower, more complex story. This wasn't D-Day. It was more like a seepage, a migration that happened in family groups and war bands over generations. They came in sturdy, clinker-built boats not to conquer an empire, but to find land, opportunity, and a place to be masters of their own fate. They arrived into a world where Roman administration had faded, but its physical fabric was everywhere. They would have seen the decaying remains of villas with their mosaic floors and hypocausts, the straight, stony spines of Roman roads slicing through the countryside, and the vast, abandoned imperial fields known as Prata. This is the murky transition of power. Historians still argue fiercely about its nature. Was it a genocide and displacement of the native Britons as the old Victorian histories claimed? Or was it a more nuanced process of elite takeover, where a small but militarily dominant Germanic-speaking minority became the new ruling class, with the existing British population gradually adopting their language, customs, and material culture? The genetic evidence adds further twists, suggesting significant continuity from the Iron Age population in some regions. The truth on the ground likely varied from place to place. Bloody conquest in one valley, peaceful negotiation and intermarriage in the next. What is clear is that the new arrivals did not move into the Roman towns. They found them eerie, alien, and perhaps cursed. Their worldview was built around the wooden hall, the kin group, and the soil, not stone forums and imperial bureaucracy. So they did what made sense to them. They looked for good, workable land, often away from the centers of old power. They sought out the lighter, well-drained soils that were easier to plow with their heavy-wheeled plows. They found a place like our Suffolk slope, near a reliable stream with a gentle aspect, and perhaps with the visible, reassuring signs of earlier farming, the clearance mounds and field boundaries of the Romano-British farmers who had worked there before the machine broke down. They weren't settling in empty land. They were picking up the tools that had been laid down. The longhouse they built was a declaration of a new order, a turn away from the Mediterranean world of Rome and back towards the woods and waters of their own northern European homelands. But even in that turn they were shaped by the world they found. The path they used and formalized may well have begun as a track between Roman fields. The very fact they could arrive and settle in relative security was a consequence of the imperial collapse that preceded them. They were the seedlings that sprouted in the cracks of a fallen empire. Let's fast forward now, several centuries past the founding of the Longhouse. The Saxon settlement has taken root, grown, and established its rhythms. Generations have been born and buried in its soil. And with that permanence comes specialization, the move from pure subsistence to a surplus economy. Our attention shifts from the domestic hearth to the edge of the settlement, where a different kind of fire burned, one not for warmth or cooking, but for transformation. In a later expansion trench, away from the main cluster of domestic buildings, the archaeologists have uncovered a series of squat, clay-lined pits, their interiors vitrified and fire-blackened to a bubbled, slag-like crust. These are kilns. Not for baking bread, but for industry. You crouch beside one, its circular form cut neatly into the yellow subsoil. It's smaller than you might expect, about the diameter of a car tire, but its purpose is written in the scorched earth and the fragments littering the spoil heap. The team has recovered thick, crude sherds of pottery, not the fine, wheel-thrown Samian ware of Rome, but hand-built vessels of local clay, tempered with gritty sand or crushed shell to stop them cracking in the heat. Some are plain, others have the simple, finger-impressed decoration of the later Saxon period. This was a pottery kiln, or perhaps a lime kiln, for burning chalk or limestone to make mortar for building, or agricultural lime to sweeten the soil. Either way, it speaks of a community that was producing more than it needed for itself. It had an industry. Imagine the scene here, perhaps in the 10th or 11th century. The settlement is no longer a lone pioneer farmstead. It's a small village, a cluster of perhaps half a dozen longhouses and associated outbuildings. One family, or one individual, has developed a particular skill. They know where to find the best clay pits, how to prepare it, how to build the rough but effective updraft kiln, and how to manage the intense, smoky fire that will turn soft, wet earth into durable, useful ceramic. The products are utilitarian, large storage jars for grain, sturdy cooking pots, simple lamps, or spindle whirls. They aren't destined for a king's table. They are for the local market, for trade with the next village, or for use within the community itself. This is the clay and the flame economy, a small but vital engine in the medieval world. The presence of such industry is a sign of stability and connectivity. It means there was a network, a local economy where specialization made sense. The potter or lime burner could focus on their craft because they could barter their wares for the grain from the farmer, the wool from the shepherd, or the iron nails from the traveling smith. It also implies a level of organization, however informal. There would have been agreements about fuel. A significant amount of wood or charcoal was needed for a firing. There would have been an understanding of land use, of where the clay could be dug without ruining good pasture. A widely accepted fact of the later Saxon period is the growth of such local industries and the emergence of wick sites and later bears, fortified towns, as centers of trade. But at the rural village level, industry was homespun and integrated into the agricultural calendar. The kiln would be fired in the drier months, when the clay could be worked and the pots dried without cracking. It was a seasonal rhythm, tied to the land as surely as plowing or harvest. And here's a lesser-known, slightly amusing detail that often emerges from such sites: the sheer rate of failure. For every successful firing, there were disasters. Pots would explode if they were too thick or had hidden air pockets. The kiln temperature could be uneven, leaving some vessels brittle and others unsintered. The archaeological record is full of wasters, the warped, bloated, or melted rejects that were tossed into a rubbish pit or used as hardcore for a path. The person who operated this kiln knew frustration intimately. They would have peered into the smoking heart of the fire, hoping the gamble of a week's work had paid off. Their success was not guaranteed by a textbook, but by hard-won, tacit knowledge passed down and refined through painful, smoky trial and error. That pile of waste sherds is a testament not just to industry, but to perseverance. Historians still argue whether these rural industries were for purely local consumption or were part of wider, regional distribution networks, with middlemen moving goods along rivers and trackways? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. A particularly skilled potter might gain a reputation, their wares traveling further afield. But mostly, the kiln served its immediate world, turning the very earth of the village into the containers that held its life, its grain, its food, its drink. It was a closed loop of practicality, fired by local wood, fueling local lives, and leaving behind, in these scorched pits, the quiet signature of a community that had learned to make more than just a living from its land. Communities, like people, have lifespans. They are born, they flourish, and sometimes, they die. The story of our Saxon village does not end with the clang of Norman armor at Hastings in 1066. It likely ends in a much quieter, more insidious way, in the 14th century, an era of profound, rolling catastrophe. The kilns fall cold. The longhouses, rebuilt and modified over generations, are not replaced when their final posts rot. The fields, so carefully cleared and tended, slowly succumb to scrub and then to woodland. The path remains, but fewer and fewer feet use it. Eventually, no one living remembers the name of the place. It becomes a lost or deserted medieval village, known only as a faint bumpiness in a pasture, a scatter of pottery in a rabbit scrape, or a name on a parchment that no longer corresponds to any inhabited spot. This is the Great Disappearance, and its causes are a silent mystery whispered by the empty earth. The prime suspect, looming large in the popular imagination, is the Black Death. The bubonic plague that swept across Europe from 1347 onwards was apocalyptic, wiping out between a third and a half of England's population in a few horrific years. A village of 15 families could be reduced to 3 or 4 in a single, terrible summer. Such a catastrophic depopulation could break the back of a community. There were not enough hands to plow all the fields, tend all the animals, or repair all the roofs. The social and economic fabric simply unraveled. Survivors, inheriting multiple strips of land, might consolidate their holdings and abandon the marginal, less productive plots. They might even pack up entirely and move to a larger, more viable settlement, leaving the old village to the ghosts and the creeping nettles. A plague pit, a mass grave, is the grim, definitive archaeological signature of such an event. But here, in our field, they haven't found one. The disappearance seems less sudden, more drawn out. This leads to other theories. Perhaps it was economic change. The 13th century had seen a population boom, with villages expanding and pushing cultivation onto poorer, more marginal soils. When the climate began to shift in the 14th century, entering a cooler, wetter period historians call the Little Ice Age, those marginal lands failed. Crops rotted in the fields, harvests became unreliable. At the same time, the manorial system was evolving. Landlords found it more profitable to convert arable land to pasture for sheep, whose wool was a lucrative cash crop for the European market. Sheep required vast grazing lands and only a handful of shepherds, not dozens of peasant families. This process of engrossment and enclosure emptied villages across England, turning thriving communities into silent sheepwalks. The people didn't die of plague, they were evicted, or left seeking work elsewhere, their homes systematically demolished to prevent their return. The village didn't succumb to disease, but to the cold calculus of the wool trade. A third, quieter possibility is environmental change or simple exhaustion. The village's water source, that vital stream, might have silted up or changed course. The soil, farmed intensively for centuries without proper rotation or manure, might have become depleted, its yields dwindling to a point where it could no longer sustain the community. Or perhaps a series of localized disasters, a fire that swept through the thatched roofs, a cattle plague, a series of poor harvests, simply sapped the community's resilience until it reached a tipping point. The families packed their few possessions onto a cart and walked down the path one final time, joining relatives in a neighboring settlement that was faring slightly better. The abandonment was not a single event, but a slow fading. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of village desertion was catastrophic mortality from plague, or longer-term socio-economic forces like enclosure and agricultural change. The truth, as always in landscape history, is likely a combination. The Black Death was the sledgehammer that shattered an already strained system. A village teetering on the edge due to poor soils or an oppressive landlord could be pushed into oblivion by the loss of half its workforce. The archaeology of our site holds clues, but not a verdict. The final layers show no evidence of violent destruction, no arrowheads, no widespread burning. They show a gradual decline in the quality and quantity of pottery finds, a cessation of new building, and then, layers of sterile soil where only wind-blown silt and root action disturb the peace. It is an ending not with a bang, but with a long, slow sigh. The woods reclaimed the fields. The timber frames of the houses collapsed, were scavenged for firewood, and were swallowed by brambles. All that remained was the path, now leading only to memories, and the shape of the land itself, waiting centuries for a trowel to ask it, gently, what happened. To truly grasp the deep-time story of this place, we must venture even further back than the Neolithic hunter, before the first Saxon post hole was dreamed of. In a trench dug at the lowest point of the site, near the old stream course, the soil changes dramatically. It's a sticky, dense layer of waterlogged peat and silt, conditions that can preserve organic material for millennia. And here, among the roots and the dark soil, the team finds pottery of a completely different character. The fragments are thick, heavily decorated with precise geometric patterns, lines of crisscrossing grooves and impressions made by a comb or cord. This is beaker pottery, named for the distinctive drinking vessels associated with the people who spread across Europe in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, around 2500 to 1700 BC. These sherds are over 3,000 years old. They represent not a settlement but a presence. The beaker folk, as archaeologists once called them, though now the term is seen as outdated, implying a monolithic people rather than a widespread cultural package, were part of a phenomenon that connected the British Isles to the continent in profound new ways. They didn't just bring a new pottery style. They likely introduced metalworking, the wheel, and new burial rites that placed individuals in single graves under round barrows, often accompanied by a beaker, archery equipment, and copper daggers. The fragment in your hand, with its precise, imprinted lines, is a tiny data point in a vast network of ideas, trade, and movement that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Scottish Isles. This discovery reframes the entire narrative of the site. We have moved from a Saxon village to a Neolithic hunting ground, and now to a point on a Bronze Age map of connections. The waterlogged ground by the stream might have been a favored crossing point, a place to camp for a night while moving herds or trading goods. Perhaps a beaker pot was dropped and shattered here, its pieces trodden into the mud and forgotten. But its presence whispers of long-distance journeys. The flint for the arrowhead could have been sourced locally, but the ideas behind the beaker pottery, and the copper for the daggers and jewelry that would have accompanied it, came from far away. It speaks of a world already in conversation with itself, where objects, styles, and technologies flowed along established routes of exchange. These were the forgotten footpaths of prehistory, following river valleys, ridgelines, and coastlines. A widely accepted fact about this period is that it marks the beginning of a more stratified society in Britain, with evidence of emerging elites who controlled access to prestigious goods like metal and fine pottery. The individual burial under a mound, as opposed to the communal tombs of the earlier Neolithic, suggests a growing focus on personal status and lineage. The person who once drank from the vessel this sherd came from was likely someone of note in their community, connected to wider networks of power and prestige that we can only dimly perceive. Finding this material on a later Saxon village site is a powerful reminder that the allure of certain landscape features, a reliable ford, a sheltered spot, a confluence of paths, transcends specific cultures and millennia. And here's a lesser-known, slightly ironic twist. For all the grandeur implied by the term Bronze Age, the daily reality for most people remained firmly rooted in stone and earth. Flint tools were still in widespread use. The bronze objects were rare and valuable. The beaker pot itself, though beautifully decorated, was a practical item. Historians still argue whether the spread of beaker culture represents a mass migration of people, the movement of a small elite group of metal workers and traders, or simply the diffusion of fashionable ideas and technology among existing populations. The genetics are still being untangled, but the pottery in the ground is a tangible link to that debate. It sits there in the tray, next to the Saxon pottery sherd and the flint arrowhead. 3 different languages of craft from 3 different ages, all found within a few dozen meters of each other. They are not in sequence. They are in conversation across time, each fragment saying, "We were here too, and we were connected to worlds you've forgotten." The Saxon path, it seems, was just the latest iteration of a route that had been facilitating journeys, trade and cultural exchange for over 3,000 years before the first Anglo ever set foot on it. The settlements of the living tell one story, written in post holes and hearths. But to understand a people's deepest beliefs, their social structure, and their sense of self, you must visit their dead. Let us leave the village now and follow a different kind of path, one that leads not to a neighboring farmstead, but out of the world of the living altogether. About a mile from our excavated longhouse, on a low, sandy hill that catches the morning sun, the landscape reveals another kind of archaeology. Here, the plough occasionally turns up fragments of human bone, corroded iron, and the glint of gilt bronze. This is an Anglo-Saxon cemetery, a field of the dead that served the community for generations. The contrast with the domestic site is immediate and profound. The world of the longhouse was crowded, noisy, and organic. This place is ordered, silent, and intended for eternity. You are not looking for stains in the earth, but for the outlines of graves cut into the chalk or sand. They might be arranged in rows, or perhaps in small, clustered family groups. The bodies were laid to rest in simple dug graves, often aligned roughly west to east, a practice that hints at the creeping influence of Christianity in later centuries, though the earlier burials might show no such consistency. Some graves are marked by nothing more than a slight dip in the soil. Others, for the most important individuals, were once covered by small mounds, now plowed flat over the centuries. This is where archaeology must work with immense care and respect, brushing away soil grain by grain to reveal the silhouette of a life that has ended. What you find in these graves is a language of belief and identity. A widely accepted fact is that the Anglo-Saxons practiced furnished burial, meaning they placed grave goods with the deceased for use in the afterlife. For a woman, this might include her jewelry, pairs of gilt bronze brooches that fastened her peplos dress at the shoulders, strings of colorful glass or amber beads, a chatelaine belt from which hung keys and small tools, symbolizing her role as mistress of the household. For a man, you might find his weaponry, a spear, its iron head placed by his side, a shield, its wooden board long rotted but its iron boss and grip still in place, and, for the elite, the ultimate status symbol, a sword, pattern welded and deadly, laid across his chest. These weren't just sentimental tokens. They were functional kits for the next world, declarations of who the person was and what rank they held. A simple knife was almost universal, a tool for every task in life and, presumably, beyond. But then there are the surprises, the burials that defy simple classification. The discovery of a child's grave with a small, carefully placed pot and a tiny bronze bell speaks of profound grief and care. A burial where the body was placed in a crouched position, or with a stone placed on the chest, might hint at older, pre-Christian superstitions about preventing the dead from walking. And then there are the truly spectacular sights that reset our entire understanding, like Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, just a few dozen miles from our field. There, in the late 6th or early 7th century, a king or great warlord was buried not in a hole in the ground, but within a 27-meter-long ship, dragged from the River Deben and buried under a mound, filled with treasures from across the known world, a gleaming helmet, gold and garnet jewelry, silver from Byzantium, and Merovingian coins. Sutton Hoo is the epic, poetic expression of the same belief seen in our humble village cemetery, just written on a grander scale. It shows that the people living in wooden halls in Suffolk were connected to a vast, sophisticated world of trade, diplomacy, and high art. Historians still argue whether the presence of grave goods directly correlates to pagan belief and the absence indicates Christian conversion, or whether the practice was more nuanced, a cultural tradition that persisted even as beliefs shifted. The truth is likely messy. But each grave, whether rich or poor, is a capsule. The position of the body, the objects chosen, even the orientation, are all statements. A lesser-known, slightly poignant detail is the frequent finding of animal bones in graves, often joints of meat, perhaps a final feast for the journey, or the remains of a personal hunting dog or horse buried alongside its master. It's a reminder that the bonds formed in life were hoped to continue in whatever came next. Standing in this quiet field, you realize the cemetery is the ultimate community archive. It holds the infant, the warrior, the weaver, the elder. It maps the social hierarchy and the family ties that bound the living village together. And it whispers that for them, the path from the longhouse to this sunny hill was not an end, but a transition. One last journey along a well-trodden track, accompanied by the objects that defined a lifetime. For centuries, the story told about the Anglo-Saxon arrival was stark and simple. Invasion, conquest, and replacement. The Venerable Bede, writing in the 8th century, laid out a neat narrative of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes arriving at the invitation of a British king, then turning on their hosts in a violent takeover. Later historians, wrapped in Victorian ideas of racial destiny, amplified this into a tale of heroic Teutonic warriors sweeping aside a feeble Romanist Celtic population, bringing with them the pure roots of the English nation and its language. It was a clean, dramatic story. But the earth, as we've seen, rarely tells clean stories. The myth of the empty land, of Terra Nullius waiting for a superior people to claim it, is one of the most persistent and damaging ideas in history. And it is crumbling under the weight of evidence from fields just like this one. The problem with the invasion model is scale and subtlety. If a vast genocidal horde had swept across Britain in the 5th century, you would expect to see a clear, brutal archaeological signature. A horizon of widespread destruction, burned towns, and a sudden, complete replacement of material culture. What we find instead is a mosaic. In some areas, like parts of East Anglia and the Thames Valley, there is a clear influx of Germanic-style buildings, pottery, and burial rites, suggesting substantial new settlement. In other regions, particularly in the west and north, continuity from the late Roman British period is much stronger. The genetic evidence adds yet more complexity, showing significant ancestry from the earlier Iron Age population across much of modern England, intertwined with new continental DNA. This doesn't look like a population replacement. It looks like a process of migration, integration, and cultural change that played out differently in different places over 200 years. So, what really happened? Modern scholarship offers models that are less cinematic but more human. One is elite takeover. Imagine a post-Roman British community, its old hierarchies weakened, facing threats from Pictish raiders from the north and Irish seafarers from the west. A small, well-armed and organized warband of Angles arrives, perhaps hired as mercenaries, foederati, to provide defense. Over time, this warrior elite, through marriage, political maneuvering, and military dominance, becomes the new ruling class. They don't massacre the locals. They become their lords. The native British population gradually adopts the language and material culture of the new elite to get ahead, much as their ancestors had adopted Roman ways centuries before. Old English becomes the language of power and prestige, while Brittonic languages fade or retreat. Another model is chain migration, where small family groups, encouraged by news from earlier pioneers, arrive over decades to settle among an existing, perhaps diminished, population, creating a patchwork where communities lived side by side, eventually blending. A widely accepted fact in current archaeology is that the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain were a period of fragmentation and localism, not a unified national drama. Our Suffolk settlers were likely one thread in this complex tapestry. They may have had little contact with or even knowledge of other Saxon groups settling 100 miles away. Their immediate concerns were their neighbors, British or otherwise. Historians still argue fiercely about the balance of these processes. How much migration, how much elite dominance, how much cultural adoption? The debate is charged because it speaks to modern questions of identity and ethnicity. But on the ground, in the day-to-day, the reality was probably pragmatic. A British farmer tending fields his family had worked for generations might find a Saxon family clearing the woodland on the next hill. There might be tension, conflict, trade, intermarriage, or simply a wary coexistence. Over generations, the distinctions blurred. The new pottery styles were adopted because they were practical. The new building techniques were used because they worked. The path between the two settlements became a route for exchange, not just of goods but of ideas, words, and genes. The myth of the empty land was convenient. It justified the dominance of a later Norman elite by giving the Anglo-Saxons themselves a foundational myth of righteous conquest. It painted the British as vanished or irrelevant. But our multi-period field, with its Neolithic arrowhead, its possible Roman-era fields, and its Saxon longhouse, tells a different story. It tells of a land that was always occupied, always being reused and reimagined. The Anglo-Saxons didn't arrive into a void. They arrived into a conversation that had been going on for millennia, and they added their own loud, compelling, and ultimately enduring voice to it. They weren't the first chapter. They were a major plot twist in a very long book. Now, let's pause and consider the classic, chocolate box image of an English village. It's a mental picture we all share. A cluster of quaint cottages with thatched roofs, lining both sides of a single, winding lane, with a duck pond, an ancient church, and a pub called the King's Arms. This is the village of storybooks, Sunday night television, and tourist brochures. It feels timeless, as if it sprang fully formed from the green English earth sometime in the distant past. Here's the surprising truth. That village is a medieval invention. The settlement you've been walking through in your mind's eye, the Saxon one with its longhouses scattered in a loose cluster, facing a common yard or a track, each with its own plot of land stretching out behind it, looked nothing like that. The Midland village, with its neat row of houses flanking a street, is a later development, a reshaping of the landscape that came centuries after the first Saxon families staked their claim. So, what happened? The shift from the dispersed farmsteads and hamlets of the early Saxon period to the nucleated, planned villages of the later medieval era was a slow revolution, driven by profound changes in how society was organized on the land. From roughly the 9th century onwards, under the pressure of Viking invasions and the growing power of Saxon kings like Alfred the Great and his successors, England saw the consolidation of the manor and the open field system. A lord, whether a thegn, a monastery, or eventually a Norman baron, asserted control over a large territory. To manage this land more efficiently and to maximize its agricultural output, and thus its tax revenue, a radical replanning often took place. The old, scattered farmsteads were deliberately abandoned. The people who lived in them were encouraged, or compelled, to relocate to a new, central site. There, they were given torfts, long, narrow house plots, lining a newly laid out street or green. Behind these torfts, stretching out into the countryside, were the great, open fields, divided into countless strips that were allocated among the villagers. This system, known as champion countryside, created the village pattern we recognize today. This means the village at the end of our footpath, the one that exists now, might have been founded long after the settlement we've been excavating was forgotten. Our Saxon families belonged to a different, older pattern of settlement, one that was ultimately overwritten. Their longhouses were isolated or formed small clusters, each a self-contained farmstead. Their fields were likely enclosed plots, not part of a vast communal system. Their community was based on kinship and proximity, not on the legal and economic bonds of manorialism. A widely accepted fact is that the Domesday Book of 1086, while recording thousands of settlements, often describes them in terms of their taxable resources, ploughs, meadows, woodland, not their shape. The physical planning of villages into their classic form often reached its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries. This reshapes our understanding of early community layout entirely. The path we've been following didn't necessarily lead to a miniaturized version of a Cotswolds village. It might have led to a clearing where 2 or 3 longhouses stood in a loose triangle, sharing a well and a bread oven. The social center wasn't a street or a green, but the individual hall itself, where the hearth group gathered. The path connected these isolated nodes to each other and to wider resources. It was a web, not a spine. Historians still argue about the causes and precise chronology of this village moment, debating whether it was primarily a top-down imposition by lords or a bottom-up adaptation by peasant communities for mutual protection and cooperation. But the result is undeniable. The English landscape we think of as ancient was, in many places, deliberately designed. So, the next time you drive through or walk in a perfect, linear village, remember, you are likely looking at a medieval new town, a deliberate piece of social and economic engineering. The true ancient landscape lies invisible around it, in the isolated moated sites, in the names of fields. Town field often marks the old open field, and in footpaths like ours, which may stubbornly follow the older, pre-village routes between those vanished farmsteads, cutting across the later field systems in defiant, illogical diagonals. Our path is a fossil of that older, more scattered world, a world that was reorganized out of existence but left its footprints in the enduring habits of the land. Even as the classic village form emerged, reshaping the human geography of England, the ghost of the earliest Saxon settlements refused to be entirely exorcised. Their imprint, faint but persistent, lingered on in the most durable of human inventions, the map. The longhouse and its associated farmstead were more than just buildings. They were the fundamental social and agricultural unit of the early period, a cell from which later, more complex organisms grew. And like a cell dividing, its influence multiplied and stretched over time, leaving its long shadow on boundaries, parishes, and patterns of land ownership that, in some cases, endure to the present day. Consider the basic unit. A family or small kin group clears a parcel of woodland or claims a swathe of abandoned Roman field. They build their longhouse. Around it, they cultivate an infield of the best soil for crops, and farther out, an outfield for pasture and seasonal grazing. This is a discrete, self-contained world. Over generations, as the family grows, A second longhouse might be built nearby for a married son or daughter, creating a hamlet. These related farmsteads would share resources, a common pasture, a woodlot, a water source. The paths between them become fixed lines of kinship and cooperation. This cluster of related holdings forms a natural territory. When, centuries later, the church began to organize the countryside into parishes, it often did so by adopting these existing secular territories. The parish boundary frequently followed the limits of that original early Saxon estate or cluster of estates. So, the walk you might take today around the edge of a parish, following a stream for a stretch, then a hedgerow, then an ancient trackway, could be tracing a property line first recognized over 1,000 years ago by the descendants of the people in our longhouse. A widely accepted fact of English landscape history is the astonishing longevity of some boundaries. The modern civil parish of a village often mirrors the extent of its medieval manor, which itself often encapsulated a pre-existing Saxon estate. The evidence is in charter boundaries recorded in Anglo-Saxon land grants, dense with descriptions of landmarks, from the old oak to the thorn bush, thence along the dike to the stone of Lefwine, and so to the great marsh. These are not arbitrary lines, they are the documented edges of a lived-in world. Our excavation may lie just inside or just outside such a boundary, a detail that would have meant everything to the inhabitants then and is now a crucial clue for historians piecing together the ancient political jigsaw. This process of aggregation and inheritance is key. That original farmstead didn't just vanish when the family died out or moved. Its land was absorbed. It might have been bought by a more successful neighbor, granted to a thegn as a reward for service, or donated to a monastery. Over the centuries, through countless transactions, inheritances, and subdivisions, the original pattern became overlaid, blurred, but never completely erased. The ghost of it remains in the pattern of field names on a tithe map from the 1840s. A field called Town End might mark the limit of the original settlement core. A mill field remembers a long-gone watermill whose existence was predicated on a Saxon water right. A thefts or 50 acres might preserve the rough size or even the name, Theoph's land, of an early holding. Historians still argue about how much continuity there truly is from Romano-British estate boundaries through to Saxon and then medieval parishes, with some seeing near total reorganization and others a remarkable persistence of core territories. But the principle is powerful. The decisions made by those first families, where to place their home, where to draw their line in the soil, echoed down the ages. The longhouse's long shadow is the shadow of property itself. It's the idea that a specific piece of the earth could belong to a specific group of people, an idea that outlasted timber and thatch, language and lordship, to become one of the most enduring frameworks of the English countryside. When you look at an ordnance survey map today and see the intricate, meandering line of a parish boundary, you are likely looking at the faded signature of a much older story, one that began with a decision made in a clearing, beside a path, over 1,000 winters ago. What is it that compels us, century after century, to walk these lines? The Saxon traveling from his longhouse to his cousin's clearing, the medieval pilgrim heading to Canterbury, the Georgian drover moving sheep to market, the Victorian antiquarian with his sketchbook, the modern rambler in breathable fabric with a GPS in their pocket. All are connected by the same fundamental impulse: to move through the landscape on a path forged by purpose. The footpath is the most democratic of monuments, built not by kings or decrees, but by repetition. It is a collective memory made manifest in mud and gravel. Walking the lost paths is an act of time travel, a gentle threading of oneself into a narrative far longer than a single lifetime. Think of the Saxon traveler. For him the path was necessity. It was the route to the stream, the way to the woodland where he coppiced hazel for wattles, the track to the meeting place at the 100 Moot. His journey was functional, but it was also sensory and social. He would know every dip and hollow, which bend was muddy after rain, where the blackberries grew thickest in autumn. He might meet a neighbor and exchange news, or a stranger and feel a spike of caution. The path was his interface with the world beyond his hearth smoke. Fast forward to the 14th century pilgrim. He might join our path where it intersects with a longer route to a shrine. For him, the journey is penitential and spiritual, each step a prayer, the blisters a form of devotion. The physical hardship of the path is part of its point. The landscape he walks through is imbued with meaning. Crosses mark wayside stops, certain trees or stones are associated with saints or miracles. The path is no longer just a utility, it is a corridor of faith. Then comes the drover in the 18th century, a practical man of business. He's moving livestock and he needs routes that avoid turnpike tolls, that have good grazing and watering points along the way. Our sunken track, now perhaps a wider droveway, serves perfectly. He walks not for himself but with his herd, his mind on distances, prices, and the state of the animal's feet. The path is an economic artery. A century later, the Romantic movement reframes the landscape. The antiquarian or early tourist walks not from need, but from curiosity and a desire for the picturesque. He sees the same sunken lane, but now it is awfully sublime, a relic of ancient Britons or druidical processions. He might sketch it or write a melancholic poem about the transience of life, his boots muddying just as the Saxons did, but for an entirely different aesthetic reason. And now the modern walker. You likely seek escape, exercise, connection to nature, or a hint of history. You follow the path because it's marked on a map as a public right-of-way, a legal concept that is itself a fascinating layer of history, born from battles against enclosure. You appreciate the dappled light through the trees, the bird song, the sense of leaving the modern world behind. But with the knowledge of what lies underfoot, the experience deepens. You are not just walking on a path, you are walking in the footsteps of a cavalcade of others. That slight, instinctive detour you take to avoid a muddy patch? 1,000 others have done the same, subtly sculpting the route. The stile you climb replaced a simpler step over or a gap in the hedge. The very fact the path exists as a right-of-way is a victory in a long, quiet war over who gets to move through the countryside. A widely accepted fact is that England's vast network of footpaths and bridleways is a unique historical archive, a map of obsolete journeys, to vanished mills, forgotten market crosses, discontinued ferry crossings. Walking them keeps that archive alive. Historians still argue about the extent to which modern recreational paths truly follow ancient routes, or whether wishful thinking often creates a false pedigree. But in landscapes like ours, where alignment and topography whisper of long use, the connection feels authentic. It's a lesser-known pleasure of landscape history, the realization that your own mundane choice to go for a walk on a Sunday afternoon is the latest expression of a human behavior as old as society itself. The destination may change, from a cousin's farm to a holy site to a country pub, but the motion, the simple rhythmic placing of one foot in front of the other along a hallowed line, remains a constant. The path is the through line. It connects the Saxon worried about his barley to the rambler worried about their parking ticket, proving that while our concerns evolve, our feet, given the chance, will always find the same good way home. We have reached the end of our walk, not on a map, but in understanding. We began in a muddy trench, fixated on a pattern of dark stains, a single house. We followed its gaze to a path, used that path to travel through time, from the deep prehistory of a flint arrowhead, through the Saxon dawn, past the rise and fall of a village, and into the age of maps and rights of way. We have seen layers accumulate like silt in a riverbed, each era depositing its own fragile evidence. Now, as the imaginary light over our excavation site fades to a soft twilight, we must ask the final, quiet question: why does it all matter? What is the value in these forgotten footpaths and the plowed-over villages they once connected? The answer lies not in treasure, but in texture. This is not a history of kings and dates. It is a history of soil, timber, and footsteps. It matters because it is the story of ordinary life, which is the bedrock upon which all grand history is built. The forgotten Saxon village, with its longhouse, its kill, and its field systems, represents the countless anonymous communities that collectively became England. Their daily struggles, to feed their families, to build a secure home, to navigate relationships with their neighbors and their environment, are the universal human story. By recovering their footprints, we recover a part of our own shared humanity. We are reminded that before there were nations, there were neighborhoods. Before there were laws written on parchment, there were understandings worn into the earth by use. This history is also a powerful antidote to the myth of emptiness. Every square mile of the British landscape, from the most remote moorland to the most manicured suburb, is a palimpsest. It has been seen, used, and shaped by people for millennia. Recognizing this breeds a deeper sense of place. That footpath you walk is not just a convenient route, it is a legacy. That oddly shaped field is not a surveyor's mistake, it is the fossil of an early enclosure. That parish boundary that follows a stream then jogs inexplicably over a hill is telling a story of a 1,000-year-old land dispute or a natural feature that has since vanished. When you can read even a little of this language, the landscape ceases to be a backdrop and becomes a manuscript, endlessly fascinating. It fosters a sense of stewardship. We are not the owners of this land, we are its current, temporary editors. The knowledge that we walk atop the homes and fields of our distant predecessors is a humbling and sobering thought, one that should inspire care, not carelessness. Finally, these forgotten footpaths matter because they represent continuity in the face of constant change. Villages were abandoned. Forests were cleared and then regrew. Languages died out and new ones took their place. But the human need to connect, to move between places of home, work, and community, proved more durable than any single settlement. The path is the ultimate survivor. It adapted from a hunter's track to a Saxon lane, from a medieval holloway to a recreational right-of-way. It is a lesson in resilience. It teaches us that while the structures we build, our houses, our institutions, our empires, are transient, the networks we create between them, the lines of relationship and communication, can have a startling longevity. They are the quiet, stubborn threads that hold the tapestry of history together, even when the individual stitches fade from view. Historians still argue about the precise interpretation of every post hole and pottery sherd, and they always will. New technologies, LIDAR, isotopic analysis, ancient DNA, will continue to rewrite the stories we think we know. That is the nature of the discipline. It is a conversation without end. But the central, calming truth remains. The past is not a foreign country. It is the very ground beneath our feet. It is in the alignment of a footpath, the name of a field, the curve of a stream. By listening to these quiet echoes under the earth, we do more than learn about the past. We learn to see the present as just one more layer in an ongoing, beautiful, and deeply human story. And in that recognition, there is a profound and gentle peace. The images in your mind begin to soften now, like watercolor left in the rain. The sharp edges of the trench blur, the specific shades of ochre and umber in the soil bleed together into a gentle, earthen haze. The precise scritch-scratch of the trowel fades, replaced by the distant, rhythmic sigh of the wind through the hawthorn hedge that borders the old path. You are no longer standing in the field, but you are not quite back in your room either. You are in the space between, where history becomes memory, and memory becomes a feeling, a slow, deep sense of connection that has no need for dates or diagrams. Let the weight of those centuries go. You do not have to hold them all at once. They are not a burden to carry, but a landscape to inhabit softly, a story to visit when the modern world feels too loud and too new. The Saxon farmer, the Neolithic hunter, the medieval potter, their worries have long since turned to dust. Their joys are silent. But the path they walked, the fundamental human act of making a way from here to there, remains. It is a comfort, isn't it? To know that the ground beneath us is not empty, but full. That our own small journeys, our daily treads from home to work, from house to shop, are part of a pattern so old it has worn grooves into the island itself. Your footsteps tonight, from your chair to your bed, are the latest echoes in a cavern of time that resonates with every quiet journey ever made. So release the details. Let the post holes fill with shadow. Let the arrowhead sink back into the safe, dark loam. The knowledge is stored now, not in your thinking mind, but in your bones, in your breath. You have walked the forgotten footpath. You have stood in the doorway of the vanished house. That is enough. The story is complete for tonight, and it ends not with a conclusion, but with a long, slow exhalation, matching your own. The landscape settles. The past sleeps. And you, dear listener, can drift away from this ancient field, back to the gentle present, carrying only the quiet, mossy piece of deep time with you. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breathing deepen. The journey is over. Rest now.